Hello, my name is Jeremy Dennis. I'm an artist and photographer from the Shinnecock Indian Nation in Southampton, New York, out on eastern Long Island in Suffolk County. I want to share a little bit about my community, the Shinnecock Nation, before I go into my work as a photographer. So I love mapping, so I'm going to start with a map. This is a map and illustration by David Bunn Martine, another living Shinnecock artist. And um, I always love starting with a map because it just gives context and relevancy to where we are in relation to each other. And it's always a good reminder to be grateful for the land and what it offers us, essentially to be able to live, operate, do the things that we love, but sometimes we overlook it. And so this is a map that I chose because it shows Long Island, New York, Brooklyn to Montauk, and it shows the 13 original tribal communities from the Canarsie all the way out to Montauk as well. But out of the 13, just two of these communities have reservations today. One is the Unkachog. They're in present-day Mastic Beach, and where I'm coming from and presenting from today, the Shinnecock Indian Nation, we have a small reservation in Southampton, New York. And so I do want to give a little bit of background to Shinnecock. For those of you who have been to our annual Labor Day weekend powwow, this building might look familiar. This is our community center, and it's in the very heart of our territory. This is where we have tribal offices. Sometimes we even have like weddings, basketball games. Yesterday was our tribal election, so we had that happening inside here. But just a little bit of background around Shinnecock. We have proudly been here for over 10,000 years and continue to be on our Aboriginal ancestral lands. Back in 2010, after over 30 years of petitioning, we finally received our federal recognition title. So we now have a government-to-government relationship with the United States, which is amazing because the territory itself is just 1 mile north to south. There's about 600 of us who live on territory, and then 1,800 people in total just around the world. So it's a strange contrast between being a sovereign nation and the reality that we face, in which so many people pass our territory and pass our community and never even know we're here. So going back to mapping, this is Shinnecock. As you can see, we're on a peninsula. We're surrounded by the Shinnecock Bay on 3 sides, and to the south, that's the Atlantic coast and the Atlantic Ocean. And so one thing I always think about when I see this image is my grandmother always used to say that we're still here because we were just pushed back so far that there was no more land for us to be pushed back to. It was only water. And so we've always been, even before European contact, on the coastline. And in fact, Shinnecock translates to people of the stony shore. So we've always lived along the coastline, along the ocean, along bays and streams. But this is our present day seal and flag. And so there's just so much symbolism. I won't go into every single image and symbol. But as you can see in the middle, we have the indigenous box turtle. Coincidentally, it also, both in the image and in real life, it has 13 sections. That represents the 13 communities of Long Island. And then the 13 sections around the shell represent the moon cycle or the calendar cycle. So even within one symbol, there's a lot of meaning. Another one I always like to point out is the bold yellow background, which is paralleled with the sunset in the background. So if you're familiar with the Native American medicine wheel, you know the 4 directions or the 4 colors are black, white, red, and yellow. Yellow typically represents the easternmost tribes, or the sun rising. And so we adopted that color for our tribal seal and flag. But one last thing I'm going to point out is the Shinnecock Indian Nation lettering. So it looks like this purple and white coloring. It kind of looks like a grid shape. This is actually our oldest ever art form. This is called a wampum beadwork. So for thousands of years, even up to today, and continuously, our ancestors and current day tribal members have been taking this local clamshell, the quahog shell on the left, and rendering it into these very delicate shell beads on the right, purple and white as well. And so this is a tradition that's ever ongoing. The most famous example of it turning from a clamshell into beads into a beautiful regalia or accessories or belts is the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois Confederacy belt. I just love the way it's used in this example, even though it's further upstate New York. But if you come to our powwow, there's also new renderings of how this shell can be used, and it's such an amazing material. Going back to the community center, this is a mural that my mother created. Her name's Denise Silva Dennis. As you can see, it's a visual timeline of our earliest history all the way up to present times, towards our Presbyterian church and everything between. But as you can see, we cultivated the land. On the left, you see a woman with a baby in a cradle on the back, and she's cultivating the corn, bean, and squash. Next to that is the box turtle. In the distance, we see the Atlantic right whale. We see shore whalers in burnout canoes. We have the wigwam to the right of that, and it just goes on and on. And so I do luckily come from a family of artists in that way, so I had that support. But as a photographer, I always think about this one image. The photo, I think, can no longer be attributed to a photographer, so it's an anonymous photographer, but it was created in 1884, and the image is actually the oldest ever image created of a group of Shinnecock people. And yet the title reads The Last of the Shinnecock Indians, Long Island, New York. And so I always think about the power of photography to provide evidence, but in this case it's a tool of domination, of genocide, of creating this myth of a vanishing race. And so in the past, photography has been used to render us invisible, and the way I try to use it today, which I'll show you in a moment, is to do the opposite. And so one of the things beyond that one image, as part of our visibility as a Indigenous community, is the fact that we're based in the Hamptons, so we're definitely overshadowed by the popular culture of the beach life, the resorts. We have some of the top 1%ers just living right across the bay from us. And so a lot of the work that I try to do as an artist is simply to create awareness of our continued presence. So even though we're sovereign, we're self-governing, you do need a lot of allies, you do need people who are educated around your issues and your history in order to move forward. And so as a visual artist, I'm always looking for text, books, research to reference to help shape some of the work I do as a photographer. So I look a lot towards this Teen Vogue article. It's titled "Invisibility is the Modern Form of Racism Against Native Americans." This one has so many great statistics around why this is an issue today. Other Indigenous authors, including Thomas King and Philip J. Deloria, have been also writing about this topic of the inconvenience of our continued presence, or the fact that when people see us or acknowledge us, it's always a surprise that Native Americans are still around. And so in these two books, there's so many of them, but I picked them out because they incorporate humor into their take on history that can sometimes be very difficult to discuss. And so in addition to invisibility and why it matters for us to be visible, this is a map of Shinnecock Reservation before the railroad came through. So everything in this darker tone is just marked everywhere with either Indigenous place names, some of our old meeting houses, some of our sacred sites. This is the Shinnecock Hills. And so I added, of course, this digital green rectangle showing our current day territory. And so this is land that we, as the Shinnecock Nation, believe has been stripped from us without compensation. It was also taken from us without approval from Congress, which was the law during that time. And so a lot of the work that we try to do in terms of awareness is to try to regain this land. One other major urgency is the fact that with climate change, we pretty much live at sea level where we currently live. Even before decades ago, it was always sort of marshland. And so it's important for us to return to our ancestral lands to elevate and maintain our connection to this place. And so going back to Shinnecock and Shinnecock overall, we're probably most known for our annual Labor Day weekend powwow. So if you do want to come visit us and learn more about our culture, this is the best time in the year to do it. It's usually September 1st to the 4th or around those dates, Friday to Monday. And this is really the part where I'm going to transition to my own work as a visual artist. I went to college at SUNY Stony Brook. I enrolled in every studio art class, from printmaking, sculpture, ceramic, and so on. And it wasn't until senior year of college that I finally did darkroom, 35 millimeter, and then eventually digital. And I remember being so shy and being a little bit socially awkward. And so I had a great mentor at that time, my relative Herbert Randall, who's a renowned photographer in his own right. And he advised me to go to places where people are expecting to be photographed. And so when you visit Shinnecock, you just see photographers everywhere. I started to join that group, and this is one of my earliest photos. This is featuring Sinead Bullock back in 2013. And so for me, powwow is just an amazing time because you're surrounded by cousins, relatives, allies, people who want to support Native culture. And so I began to travel the powwow circuit, and all throughout New England, I had the opportunity in 2015 to travel with my godfather, Keith Phillips. You can see him on the left in the ribbon shirt, with a blue ribbon shirt in this image. And so in 2015, every single weekend in the summer, we would go to different nations' powwows, and I would just amass this huge collection of thousands of images. And so eventually, towards the end of my undergrad program, I began to combine this huge archive with what I was learning in class, which was Northern Italian Renaissance and biblical depictions. And so I really love the idea that artists had this central role in society, translating these texts or these stories that we all value into images that everyone can enjoy. And so this is one example of that. Instead of Christian stories, I began to render Native American creation stories. And so this is Choknanipak, Man of Flint. And each story has a learning opportunity, maybe an origin story. This one is a image about why when you go out in nature, you just see rocks everywhere you go. And so it's a result of these two brothers fighting for a very long time and having this huge chase. Originally, when I was working on this series, I was actually in a printmaking class, and so I was using Photoshop and digital manipulation in order to eventually turn them into prints. But eventually I just really loved the idea of how they looked as photography. This was so important to me because I love looking at creation stories, reading about them, and seeing how unique ours are. And I think unfortunately, when I went out to seek these stories and gather research, you would either have to go into the dusty areas of archives or areas of bookstores that are underutilized, or sometimes even the kids sections of fairy tales. So I thought that photography would be a great way to elevate these stories and turn them from something like a fairy tale that we all know um, maybe has no truth to it or is too unrealistic, into a photo, which is oftentimes still regarded as proof of something. And so a lot of these images are a little bit of magic realism, like you can imagine it really happening, and at the same time, they're created in the same way that, for example, paper collage is created. So it's many, many layers of different elements to create this illusion of um, maybe it did actually happen in this one frame, and I was just there, luckily taking a photo. And so a lot of this effort of spending time with this text and these stories is a effort to reconnect with ancestry. And so I'm a big believer that the people and ancestors who told these stories remain alive and remain honored by continuing to tell these stories. And so I started this series in 2013, and finally, 5 years later, the work was, I guess, valued and elevated thanks to the Parish Art Museum. And that was my first ever showing in my career, kind of a major solo show. And so that was 2018, and this is currently on view with the MTA Arts in New York City. So I think it's so amazing that it started out with stories that were so underappreciated, stories that were so hard to find, and to just trying to share them. And now, in such a huge city, people can now enjoy them and hopefully remember them and do their own research as well. And so after creating about 100 images, really there's a story for everything, a story for why every animal is the way it is and why the land is and where we all come from. But after creating 100 of those images, I made a departure and began working on a series called Behind the Dance. And so it's very much a photojournalistic effort. So it's a total opposite end of the spectrum from before I was using photography like painting. I was setting up images and trying to create images from already existing text. And in Behind the Dance, it was entirely new content. It was documenting Indigenous people as we are today and telling our stories as they are today. And this is such a important step for me because I think when we think of Native culture, we already think of it in terms of maybe the romanticized vision that Native Americans are one with nature, or we're stuck in the past, all these negative things. And so as a visual artist, sometimes you have to be your own critic and move on and create that balance for yourself. And so most of these portraits actually took place, again, throughout New England. And so at the same time I was working on the previous series, I was also working on this series, and finally created a self-published book from the work. The great thing about working with self-publishing is, especially when you're not confident as an artist or a photographer at this point, you can actually create a draft of your book. And so this image always makes me laugh because the individual in the back is actually reading a early version of the book, and the individual in the foreground is currently being interviewed. And so it's just a wonderful capturing of that one moment, because really everyone in the book is so familiar with one another. It's either your cousins, other people who are dancing, and you see them every year. And so the person's really just reacting to seeing that and the happiness behind finally being asked to tell your story and being asked in a respectful way. And so with the photojournalism in mind, I began to work on a new project right out of grad school. And so I went to Penn State for 2 years. I had a mentor, Lonnie Graham, and together we applied for a $10,000 grant to pursue a project called On This Site, Native Long Island. And so it currently continues to exist at www.nativelongisland.com. But essentially, it's a site-specific history project throughout Long Island that lays out all of our site-specific histories, sacred sites, ancestral lands, and place names. And so this is our archive in a way. There's an author and researcher, William Wallace Tooker. He was, in a way, an anthropologist before that was even a field of study. And so back in 1911, he actually published a book that features over 450 Native American place names just here on Long Island. And so my work as a photographer is trying to visit every one of these places, try to document them as they are today. And even just within about 100 years, so many of these places have changed, been developed, been destroyed, and then just a handful of them still exist as they once were. The amazing thing about that book is Suffolk County Archaeological Association already attempted to lay out all these places, but I won't be able to zoom in. But if you're able to see Montauk on the eastern tip, it's basically just a cluster of place names. And so the way that I'm using the website, it's actually based on Google Maps. So you can actually zoom in so close that you can see houses and roads and all of those details. So it'll give you a much better sense of where these places are and how they're relevant to you as a neighbor or current day inhabitant of our ancestral territories. And so part of the motivation behind this project is the fact that in 2016, when you Googled Shinnecock, you would basically have a paragraph of who we are in general terms. But when you visit the website, it's just a overwhelming amount of information. And I always tell people that I'm just scratching the surface when it comes to what you can read about and what you can appreciate. Of course, it's just one contributor, and most of these things are personally transcribed and typed up and added just in terms of like interest and relevancy. And so this next slide kind of shows the folder to-do list. And so when I was in public school, we learned about the Iroquois, the Wampanoag, Thanksgiving, but nothing about local Indigenous history. And so when I started this project, I thought there'd maybe be 7 sacred sites that really have to be focused on, maybe not much beyond that. But when I went out to archives, I personally scanned so many different materials that currently I'm at over 1,800 different PDFs and images. And so some of these are single page images that you see on the right. That's one of our ancestors' structures in the Shinnecock Hills. And some of them are entire textbooks that are over 600 pages long. And so a lot of the times at this point, instead of just working down the list and trying to type them all up, I try to work in terms of if there's an opportunity to show, and I try to narrow down research into that one specific topic. Mapping is such a big part of the project. When I was in school, one of the negative things that always stuck with me was the way that fellow classmates always regarded our culture and history as so irrelevant because of the fact that it's been 10,000 years up until the present. And so by using mapping, this project allows people to appreciate history in terms of places that we occupy or pass every single day. And so some of these lands are contested, some of these lands are in the process of being either built upon or protected as well. So it's a great way to present history in a new way. I also just love the idea of mapping out place names, and I'm just so amazed that so many of them were preserved throughout history. Many of them were preserved at all simply because they were used as boundary sections. So during land transactions, usually they would mark out maybe the western or the easternmost border of a land being traded, and they would use the native place name for that site. And so, unfortunately, you have the name preserved, but not the translation or the meaning. And so, I'm hoping that in the future, if all of these places are finally laid out and visited, then you're able to get a sense of what they once meant through the resources there and how they compare to one another in terms of the natural resources. And so it is just a powerful gesture as well to reclaim these places because the unfortunate reality is many people on Shinnecock, it can very easily become a bubble because you have the support and the comfort of being surrounded by family, and that's such a beautiful thing. But sometimes that allows you to just not explore the world, not to leave the territory. And so by essentially creating a map of places our ancestors once thrived upon and freely accessed, that's a open invitation for all of us to maybe revisit, maybe reclaim, maybe try to purchase some of these sites and try to seek out that way of life once again. And so, again, I know that mapping has been a tool for privatizing land, for valuing land. And so, as a indigenous maybe artist or someone who appreciates history, I'm hoping this is just a new avenue or offering a new potential. And so when I was researching this topic, I was always puzzled by why is it that none of this was really taught in school. And so in my own research, every time I learned about ancestors in the 18th and 19th century, even all the way to the 20th, one of the main ways that you would learn about individual biographies is through obituaries. And so, unfortunately, even though that's an amazing archive or record, so often when elders would pass away, they would be described as the last of the true Shinnecock or the last full blood or the last king or queen, even. And so, this goes back to the Teen Vogue article, the two books I showed, and how it relates to an idea of a vanishing race. And so simply putting this work out there, giving it the stage that it needs, I think that we're slowly undoing this myth and revealing to the world that we're still here and still have something to offer. And so the project is ever ongoing. I'm always going into the field. It's mostly just day trips. Within landscape photography, they have the golden hour in which the sun is just about to go down. The land is illuminated in such a beautiful way. And so it really only offers you maybe one site per day to go out and photograph. But sometimes, since I'm especially a portrait photographer, sometimes I just go out like when it's too sunny or it's not the right time, and it's just such a amazing feeling just to be there because yeah, we as indigenous people have such a unique connection to the land that many people don't share. In addition to a website, the project exists as a book and a traveling exhibit. And so, especially before the pandemic, this show was traveling to historical societies, local art institutions and museums. It's in many collections, and even sometimes in cafes and informal spaces like that. I mentioned it before, but I thought that maybe there would be just a handful of sites that this would focus on. But coming across something called shell middens, these are basically shell piles. Wherever there was a village on Long Island, the people in the area would harvest and eat these clam shells and put them in a communal pile so that when they're cracking in the fire, you don't want to just throw it randomly because you might step on these and they're very sharp. And so these would actually continue to exist as shell piles for hundreds and thousands of years after this point. And so they were virtually everywhere on Long Island. And so I think that's such an amazing record as well in terms of wherever you would see these, which were everywhere, you would know that our ancestors once lived just within that radius. And so on the right, we see even an amazing site there. Within the Shinnecock Hills Golf Club's property, there's a shell midden in the foreground. And really, it's just so surprising because this is a place that's so hilly, it's so far away from places that you can even get maybe shell fish or clams even. And I think that just shows the abundance of this material. Unfortunately, later in the colonial period, farming was such a huge thing on the island, so many of these clams and shells were put into the ground as fertilizer. Others were also put into foundation mix. So I think that when you go around older structures, you could probably see shells within the foundation. And so, unfortunately, a lot of the cultural items that you could sometimes find discarded in these piles were lost in that way. Finally, I had sacred sites, historic sites, shell middens. Another controversial category I include is sacred sites and sites that relate to oral histories. I think we still regard history in terms of whatever's written down is the truth, and it's the truth until you find something new or something more compelling. And anything that's passed down generation to generation is just a myth or it's not true. So I try to include as many of these stories as possible to give legitimacy. One of these sites is called Sachem's Hole, and in addition to including this, so many times throughout our history, there's just no painting, there's no photograph to depict that site. And so as a portrait photographer, I was able to depict what happened here. And so in 1651, just very briefly, there was a leader. His name was Pegaticut, and he was the sachem of the people of Manhasset or Shelter Island. And he was so revered at the time of his passing in 1651 that he had a funerary procession from Shelter Island all the way to Montauk, which is 20 miles on foot. And halfway between, near East Hampton, his body was laid to rest so that they could get some rest in their procession. So ever since then, the site has become hallowed ground, and people would always pass. Whenever people would pass, they would clear the ground in that area. Unfortunately, during that time, it was just a walking path, and then that walking path became a wagon trail, then it became a narrow highway, and then it became a huge turnpike. And so when it expanded, unfortunately, the site was destroyed, but they still mark it today with a small metal sign. Really, the starting point of this project on this site started with a place called Sugarloaf Hill. This is our most important sacred site and cemetery for Shinnecock people. This is just 5 minutes from our current reservation. It's the highest point in the Shinnecock Hills. And through recent ground penetrating radar, we finally learned that over 10,000 of our ancestors are buried on this site. And unfortunately, in the year 1990, the house that you see in this image was built, and it wasn't until 30 years later, around 2021, that the site was finally purchased, thanks to the nonprofit Peconic Land Trust and Roger Waters of Pink Floyd, of all people. So they put together a fund to purchase the property, demolish the house, try to restore and preserve the site, and eventually it will return to Shinnecock title, which is such a historic moment. I think that all of the Shinnecock Hills should eventually be transferred the same way, but this is maybe an exception in Southampton Town's eyes because of its sensitivity. And so this is a 3,000-year-old site that has always been known and protected by us. But this next slide has a new project. This is one of our economic development initiatives called the Shinnecock Monument, and this was built in 2019. And so if you passed through on Montauk Highway, you probably have seen this 3-story tall LCD screen. And so I'm not going to go too much into the controversies and how our tribal trustees are still being sued for this project, but I think it's just so amazing that on the same map, just walking distance even, these two places are right next to each other. So it kind of shows that we're still here, still contributing, and making our presence known. And so I showed the folder of the to-do list. This is the map version of that. Everything in red, I still have to go out and photograph. Everything in green and blue, I also have to go and finalize. But most of the things on Eastern Long Island are actually viewable. And so I worked on the site project for about a year during that point, and I was offered a residency program at Vermont Studio Center. And of course, I'd be leaving the territory. I'd be in an entirely new place. And so I began to wonder, what should I work on, or what should I do? And so I started a project called Nothing Happened Here. This was a project that was a little bit of a juxtaposition between the title stating that there's nothing to look at or nothing to suspect, but in the image you see these individuals with arrows impaling them, sort of like Saint Sebastian, and yet the expression on their faces is just maybe moments of idleness, moments of maybe contemplation, or maybe they're in deep thought. And the whole point of this project is to signify or represent the shared trauma or the inheritance of our country's history, the fact that it was founded on genocide, and we all know that fact, but many of us also acknowledge that there has never been any meaningful reconciliation in terms of land back, apologies, compensation, anything like that. And so the arrows are supposed to represent the burden of what we carry every day as Americans, not just Americans, but people who come to this land and come for its resources that were rendered and gathered through the theft of land from Indigenous people. And so it's a project that definitely creates connection between Indigenous people and non-Native people in a way that's a little bit eye-opening. It's very engaging with different audiences, and that's something that's so important to me, because when I'm in the Hamptons and I tell people I'm Shinnecock or Native, there's an immediate wall that we have nothing in common, that there's probably some sort of anger or hostility, and yet this project is all about showing our shared wound in a way. And so the arrows really represent the mental anguish and the guilt and the thing that we wish we could pull out to alleviate this pain, but have yet to do so. And so again, I'm much more of a portrait photographer, and so I'm going to go back to Shinnecock portraits and share this brief project. In 2018, after returning home from a couple of residencies, I started a project called Shinnecock Portrait Project, which, just like Behind the Dance, is ambitious in the sense that I'm hoping that I have a one-on-one interview and portrait session with every living tribal member, all 600 plus of us. And we do have a history of anthropologists coming to our territory, sometimes for eugenic purposes, sometimes for anthropology, sometimes for many different reasons. But we've always been proudly photographed and interviewed. And I feel like this is something that in recent times we've been hesitant to. There's always been a hesitancy, trusting people from the outside to tell our story. And so this is a great way to accomplish that. One other motivation beyond that is the fact that working on this site, you just look at so many maps. And one example of that is Google Street View. There's the little orange guy you can drag onto Google Maps, and you get the 360-degree panorama of that place. And yet in this image, you can see Shinnecock Nation is completely void of that service. And so in one interpretation, maybe it's Google respecting our privacy, but on the other end, Indigenous people are always left out in terms of representation. And so one of the really cool things about the platform is that you can actually upload your own 360 images. And so it's really supposed to be used for like maybe the Google vehicle can't reach a place, or maybe it's just a touristy image of a landscape. So I actually upload tribal members with their permission, and some of these have gotten like tens of thousands of views. So in a way, it's basically rendering us visible in ways that is very modern, very technical. And one of the rules of Shinnecock is when you're on territory, you have to be accompanied by a tribal member. And so this is just a digital way of doing that. And so if you want to see Shinnecock, you have to see us as well, as sort of the message behind this whole project. And so this is something that's visible on your phone, on your computer, and each one of these blue icons represents one of those portraits. But since the pandemic and social distancing, I began to look at archives of Shinnecock people. There's hundreds and hundreds of them, and each family also has their own private photo collection as well. So we're also trying to bring this together so that we can all enjoy and look back and honor our ancestors. With residencies and portraiture in mind, I began to develop a new series called Rise, Rise, and it sort of had two, maybe even more major influences. One is the fact that on this site, we have this new map of our ancestral lands that basically is an invitation to revisit them, to maybe try to reclaim them in many different ways, simply by going there and taking up space is one way. And in that sense, this project is also referencing the history of the occupation of Alcatraz, the occupation of Wounded Knee, the BIA building, and many other examples of that. And so this, instead of those major institutions, it much more focuses on the everyday, and it kind of paints the image that Indigenous people have always been here. We've just been overlooked, and it's almost as if these buildings popped up, and yet we've never really moved. We've been rooted in these places. And so the title Rise, R-I-S-E, relates to an uprise, like activism, but it's also relevant to pop culture. So it's relevant to zombies in pop culture, zombie movies and comics. And so in those content, it's the undead coming back to haunt the living. But in my case, it's a supposed vanishing race who never really disappeared. And so a lot of this is self-portraiture. It's duplicating myself multiple times to create that illusion that we're this huge mass of people who have never been displaced. And a lot of the times I work with art history. I think as an Indigenous artist, maybe art critics or art journalists don't really know what to do with your work or where to place it. So a lot of it is remixing other reference material and creating it on your own. The other reason I do that, appropriation art in a way, is because I always try to imagine what would our art look like if we never had colonization and genocide. Like how many generations is that of artists who were denied? And a lot of these paintings I like to look at are European origin. They come from the 1600s to the 1900s, and so it's another parallel right there. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit to um, a series called The Lazy. This is an issue that we have in the Hamptons, where a lot of our storefronts become vacant in the off season, which is 3/4 of the year. And so, just like Rise, I'm trying to make a parallel between who we are as Shinnecock people and the fact that we had our land taken from us because of the lack of industrializing our land. And so, one of the justifications for stealing our land was either no one was using it, no one was living there, no one was cultivating a farm there, and so therefore it must be free for Europeans to take. And so this is a 21st version of that, a 21st century version, where as Indigenous people, we're seeing the opposite happen. And this is a problem that's everywhere in the country. We have vacant homes, especially here in the Hamptons, like 13-bedroom mansions and homes that are occupied 2 weeks out of the year, and yet we still claim to have a housing problem. And then we have storefronts that only operate in the summer, and then when they do operate, they want to sell $400 purses, and you never see anyone actually in there. So this is a problem that we, as people who live here year round, and on top of that, we don't have any Shinnecock stores in town. We don't have that revenue. We don't have that representation in town. And so it's just a terrible problem that can so easily be solved just through collaboration. And so this project really tries to insert ourselves into a solution. I'm also going to skip ahead to the Moss House project because I don't want to take up too much time, and every one of these different projects I could just go on and on. And so Moss House is a project that is ever growing. It's a up and coming communal art space on the Shinnecock Reservation. My family and I, back in 2020, decided to work on our 1960 family home during the time of the pandemic because so many things like jobs and opportunities were canceled, and all you could do was stay home. And so this is a family home that we had to move out of because here on Shinnecock, it's so hard to get insurance, it's so hard to afford house repairs. You also can't get mortgages for homes. So many homes are built room by room or wall by wall even, and that results in sometimes 3 or 4 or 5 generations of families living in the same house until someone can maybe get a small structure next door to build. And so back in 2020, we attempted to restore the house. And so this is a little bit of a before and after of that project. We were also inspired by the politics of the time. This was the peak of BLM, the Black Lives Matter movement. We witnessed as a nation police brutality, the murder of George Floyd, and the fact that people of color needing space to heal and needing safe spaces. And so what we wanted to do with Ma's House and having a space on Shinnecock was create that space. Another thing that's unfortunate but is still ongoing is the fact that our museum has been closed for about 6 or 7 years at this point. And so not only does the outside community need space for healing, but our own community needs space for artists and expression. And so this house has been improving since 2020. This is another before and after of our residency program dedicated to artists of color. And so BIPOC is Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And we focus on Black and Indigenous because, again, the fact of this nation's origin is built on genocide of Indigenous people and the enslavement of Black people as well. And so we create this new group to acknowledge that need for healing and that need for coming together to create something even larger. And so with the financial issues and being an artist and being in the Hamptons, you really don't have the means to do this type of project. And so we started a GoFundMe campaign, and we thought we would raise maybe 2,000 or 3,000, but we eventually raised over 40,000, and that was enough to turn it into a livable state. And so instead of turning it just into my home, we dedicated it into communal art and eventually a nonprofit. And so we have a communal library, we have a residency program, we have exhibits year-round, every Friday a workshop. And so it's a very lively yet humble, modest space. I wanted to show this image because my mom is a big contributor and one of our team members, but this was her exhibit back in 2021. And this was the first time my mom, who went to school for studio art, same as I did, had a solo show of her work in 40 years. And so there's so many of these incremental accomplishments that we've created simply by offering space, and so many people we have to thank for making that possible. And so one of the amazing things is since we started, there's 2 different documentaries about Ma's House. One is on PBS, the other is on the Reciprocity Project. Both are online and free to stream, and they also feature other living Shinnecock visual artists as well. If you'd like to learn more about this project, it's www.mashouse.studio. We're also open by appointment, and like I said before, the best time to come visit is during our powwow. And so this is the flyer from last year. I have to update it once it's ready for this year, but I invite you all to come during that time. We'll have a powwow booth as well. But I want to thank you for listening and hope that this inspires you to learn more about Shinnecock. So thank you.